Sir, the restroom is back that way, near the cheap seats where you belong. The automatic glass doors of JFK's Terminal 4 hissed open with mechanical precision, releasing a wave of humid July air that carried the distinctive scent of jet fuel mixed with the exhaust fumes from a dozen idling ground vehicles. Jerome Washington stepped through the entrance, his worn Nike Jordans making soft, squeaking sounds against the polished marble floor as he adjusted the frayed strap of his canvas messenger bag. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had perhaps spent the night crashing on a friend's couch after a long shift at some blue-collar job, maybe construction or warehouse work. His Northwestern University hoodie, once a deep purple, had faded to a mottled gray after years of wash cycles, and the drawstrings were so frayed they looked more like pieces of old rope than functional clothing accessories. His dark jeans bore the kind of honest wear that comes from actual use rather than expensive distressing, and there was a small tear near the left knee that he had never bothered to repair. Jerome moved through the bustling terminal with the slow, deliberate gait of someone carrying an invisible weight, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced awareness of a man who had learned long ago to read rooms before entering them fully. The truth was far more complex than his appearance suggested, and infinitely more powerful than anyone in that terminal could have imagined. Jerome had just emerged from a 72-hour negotiation marathon that had taken place in a windowless conference room 30 floors above the streets of Manhattan, where he had spent 3 sleepless days, orchestrating the acquisition of a 51% controlling stake in Pinnacle Airways through his private equity firm, Meridian Capital. The papers had been signed at 4:30 that morning, making him the majority owner of one of America's largest airline companies. But the exhaustion of the deal had left him looking like anything but a corporate titan. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, and the stubble along his jawline was flecked with premature gray that made him appear older than his 42 years. His eyes bloodshot from countless hours spent reviewing financial documents and legal contracts carried the kind of weariness that comes not from physical labor, but from the mental exhaustion of moving hundreds of millions of dollars across balance sheets, while attorneys argued over subclauses that could determine the fate of 40,000 employees. Jerome navigated through the sea of travelers past businessmen in $1,000 Italian suits who barked orders into their phones, past families dragging screaming toddlers toward security checkpoints, past the endless parade of humanity that filled America's busiest airports every single day. He moved toward the far end of the terminal, toward the hushed, carpeted sanctuary of Pinnacle Airways' first-class check-in area, where the lighting was softer and the noise level dropped to a more civilized volume. The first-class section was separated from the chaos of the main terminal by velvet ropes and potted plants, creating an oasis of calm that was designed to make wealthy passengers feel insulated from the common experience of air travel. Behind the mahogany counter stood Brittany Lawson, a young ground agent whose platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Her name tag gleamed under the warm lighting, and her crisp Pinnacle Airways blazer was tailored to perfection, every button polished to a mirror shine. Brittany's eyes tracked Jerome's approach with the kind of predatory awareness that comes from years of making snap judgments about people based on their appearance and presumed net worth. She saw the hoodie, the worn jeans, the scuffed sneakers, and her brain immediately began processing this information through a filter of assumptions that had been reinforced by management training sessions about security threats and inappropriate passengers. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of artificial politeness that barely concealed underlying irritation. "Sir, the restroom is back that way, near the cheap seats where you belong." She pointed aggressively toward the public facilities near the economy check-in area, her manicured fingernail extended like a weapon aimed at his dignity. Jerome stopped walking and turned slowly, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharpening with the kind of focus that comes from a lifetime of recognizing these moments for exactly what they were. He had been expecting this, had actually been curious to see how long it would take before someone made assumptions about his right to be in this space, but the speed and casual cruelty of the dismissal still managed to surprise him. "I'm not looking for the restroom," Jerome replied, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that carried the authority of boardrooms and negotiating tables, though Brittany was too focused on his appearance to register the tone. "I'm here to check in for my flight." He stepped toward the velvet rope that separated the first-class area from the general terminal, but Brittany moved quickly to intercept him, physically positioning herself to block the gap in the barrier. She crossed her arms over her chest, causing her blazer to strain against the buttons, and her lips curved into the kind of smile that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with exercising the small amount of power her position afforded her. "This area is exclusively for first-class passengers," she announced loudly enough for other travelers to hear her voice carrying across the quieter section and drawing curious glances from passengers who were waiting in line behind mahogany counters. "Economy check-in is located at gates H through J, which are back that way, where the regular people check in for their regular seats." Jerome sighed a long exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 similar encounters stretching back across decades of his life. He didn't have the energy for this confrontation. Not today. Not after 3 days of negotiations that had left him mentally drained and physically exhausted, but he also recognized that this was exactly the kind of moment that revealed the true character of an organization when no one thought the owner was watching. "I understand where I am," Jerome said calmly, reaching into the front pocket of his hoodie to retrieve a folded boarding pass and his black American Express Centurion card. "I'm booked on Flight 847 to London. Seat 1A. The confidence in his voice didn't match his appearance, and for a moment Brittany hesitated, her certainty wavering as she processed the disconnect between his calm authority and her assumptions about his economic status. But her training had taught her that confidence could be faked, that people often tried to bluff their way into spaces they didn't belong, and the evidence of her eyes seemed more reliable than the tone of his voice. She snatched the boarding pass and passport from his hands with unnecessary force, her movements sharp and theatrical as she walked back to her computer terminal. Her fingers attacked the keyboard with aggressive precision, each keystroke loud and deliberate as she prepared to prove what she already knew to be true, that this man was either lying or had somehow obtained documents that didn't belong to him. The computer screen flickered to life, displaying information that made Brittany's confident expression freeze mid-smirk. Instead of the error message she had expected, the system flashed bright green and displayed text that she had never seen before in her 3 years with the company. "Passenger Washington Jerome. Status Meridian VIP. Handle with extreme discretion. Notify management immediately of any issues." Brittany blinked hard and hit the refresh key, certain that the system had made some kind of error, but the same message appeared again, accompanied by a soft chiming sound that indicated the highest level of passenger priority. She looked up at Jerome, who was watching her with an expression of patient curiosity, as if he were genuinely interested in observing how she would handle this unexpected information. "Is there some kind of problem?" Brittany Jerome asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough emphasis on her name to let her know that he had been paying attention to details while she had been making assumptions. No problem at all. Mr. Washington." Brittany stammered, her voice suddenly smaller as she printed his boarding pass with hands that had developed a slight tremor. She couldn't meet his eyes as she slid the documents back across the counter, her earlier aggression replaced by the kind of nervous energy that comes from realizing you've made a significant mistake in judgment. As Jerome collected his documents and walked toward the security checkpoint, Brittany turned to her colleague Madison, a similarly blonde agent who had been watching the interaction with interest. "Who do you think that guy really is?" Madison whispered, leaning closer to avoid being overheard. "System says he's some kind of VIP, but look at him," Brittany replied, her voice carrying further than she intended. "He's probably some rapper who got lucky, or maybe one of those lottery winners who thinks money can buy class. You know the type, Madison, they get a little cash and suddenly think they belong in first class, but they still look like they just rolled out of bed in the projects." Jerome kept walking. his face impassive as he absorbed every word, but internally he was making careful mental notes about the culture of assumptions and casual prejudice that seemed to permeate the ground-level operations of his newly acquired airline. This wasn't just about one employee having a bad day or making an innocent mistake. This was about ingrained patterns of thinking that would need to be addressed at the most fundamental level if Pinnacle Airways was going to represent the kind of company he wanted to own. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner sat gleaming on the tarmac like a technological marvel sculpted from aluminum, and Dream's its sleek fuselage reflecting the afternoon sun while ground crews performed their final preparations for the transatlantic journey to London Heathrow. This particular aircraft was the crown jewel of Pinnacle Airways' fleet, featuring only 12 first-class suites arranged in a configuration that prioritized privacy and luxury above all other considerations, with each suite containing a bed that could extend to full horizontal, a private entertainment system with a 24-inch display, and enough space for passengers to move around comfortably during the 8-hour flight. Jerome made his way down the jet bridge surrounded by the usual collection of first-class passengers who represented the kind of wealth and status that airlines courted most aggressively. There was a tech executive in a navy pinstriped suit who smelled of expensive cologne and carried himself with the particular arrogance that comes from disrupting industries and accumulating billions before age 40. An elderly woman draped in pearls who was complaining loudly to her assistant about the temperature of the jet bridge, and a handful of other travelers who wore their privilege like expensive accessories. As Jerome approached the aircraft entrance, the atmosphere inside the cabin became immediately apparent through careful staging and lighting designed to create an environment that felt more like a luxury hotel lobby than the interior of a commercial aircraft. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers. The lighting was set to a warm golden tone that suggested perpetual sunset, and the air carried the subtle scent of leather and vanilla that was pumped through the ventilation system to enhance the sensory experience of wealth. Standing at the entrance with perfect posture and a smile that had been calibrated through years of training was Savannah Reed, the lead flight attendant whose platinum blonde hair was styled in an elegant chignon that complemented her crimson lipstick and the tailored uniform that emphasized her role as the gatekeeper of luxury service. She had been with Pinnacle Airways for 18 years, accumulating commendations from celebrity passengers and corporate executives who appreciated her ability to anticipate their needs while maintaining the perfect balance of professionalism and deference. Savannah's greeting ritual was a carefully choreographed performance that began the moment passengers appeared in the doorway. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Henderson," she said warmly to the tech executive, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm as she touched his arm lightly in a gesture of familiar recognition. "It's absolutely wonderful to see you again, and I want you to know that your usual Macallan 18-year-old is waiting for you in your suite along with those dark chocolate truffles you enjoyed so much on your last flight with us." The elderly woman received similar treatment, with Savannah addressing her as Mrs. Pemberton and inquiring about her grandchildren by name while helping her navigate toward her suite with the kind of attentive care that made passengers feel like they were visiting old friends rather than paying customers. Each interaction was personalized, warm, and designed to reinforce the passenger's sense of importance and belonging in this exclusive environment. Then Jerome stepped forward, and the transformation was as sudden as it was unmistakable. Savannah's radiant smile didn't vanish entirely, but it became brittle and forced like sugar glass that might shatter if subjected to any pressure. Her eyes moved quickly from Jerome's face to his hoodie, down to his scuffed sneakers, and back up to his face, processing this visual information through the same filter of assumptions that had guided Brittany's behavior at the check-in counter. "Boarding pass," Savannah said curtly, extending her hand without the warmth or courtesy she had shown to the previous passengers. It wasn't a request or a polite inquiry. It was a command delivered with the kind of authority that suggested she had already decided this interaction was going to be problematic and wanted to resolve it as quickly as possible. Jerome handed her his documents, noticing immediately that she held his boarding pass up to the light as if checking for counterfeit watermarks, a security measure she hadn't employed with any of the other passengers despite the fact that they were all traveling on identical tickets. She scrutinized the seat assignment with particular attention, her eyebrows knitting together as she processed the fact that this man who looked like he had dressed from a donation bin was apparently assigned to Suite 1A, which was typically reserved for their most valued customers. Suite 1A, she muttered more to herself than to Jerome, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that suggested she was questioning either the accuracy of the document or the legitimacy of his presence in first class. "Right. First aisle on your left, and please try to stow that bag quickly so you don't block other passengers who are still boarding behind you." Jerome stepped into the cabin proper, immediately struck by the stark contrast between the luxurious environment and the cold reception he had received. The first-class section was indeed magnificent, with each suite featuring sliding doors for privacy, gold-trimmed accents that caught the carefully designed lighting, and seats that looked more like furniture from a high-end furniture showroom than airline seating. He located Suite 1A and settled into the leather seat, which was so comfortable it seemed to mold itself to his body. Across the narrow aisle in Suite 1B sat Bradley Morrison, the tech executive who had received such warm treatment from Savannah, already nursing a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid and scrolling through messages on a phone that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Behind Jerome, a young venture capitalist was adjusting noise-canceling headphones that looked like they had been crafted by precision engineers rather than mass-produced in factories. As the boarding process continued, Jerome watched Savannah and her colleague Kyle, a younger flight attendant, whose nervous energy suggested he was still learning the intricate social dynamics of first-class service, move through the cabin with a silver tray laden with crystal flutes filled with Dom Perignon champagne. They approached each suite with ritualistic precision, offering pre-flight beverages to passengers with the kind of flourishes that made the service feel like a performance, designed to reinforce the exclusivity of the experience. Champagne Mr. Henderson Savannah cooed as she reached Morrison's suite, her voice carrying the same warmth she had displayed during boarding. "I know you prefer it well chilled, so I made sure this bottle spent extra time in our refrigeration unit." Morrison accepted the flute with a casual nod that suggested he was accustomed to this level of attention, and Savannah moved to the next suite where she continued the same ritual with similar enthusiasm and personalized touches that demonstrated her extensive knowledge of passenger preferences and histories. When they reached Jerome's row, Savannah paused directly in front of him, looking down with an expression that seemed to be calculating something behind her professionally trained smile. She glanced at the remaining champagne flutes on her tray, then looked at Jerome again, and then turned to Kyle with the kind of subtle signal that experienced service professionals use to communicate without words. "Kyle, we need to check on the galley inventory before we complete the beverage service," she announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear her voice carrying an artificial urgency that suggested some kind of important behind-the-scenes issue required immediate attention. "Let's make sure we have sufficient supplies for all of our valued passengers." She pivoted sharply and walked toward the galley area without offering Jerome anything, leaving him sitting in his suite while other passengers continued to receive their pre-flight champagne and warm greetings. The omission was so deliberate and obvious that Morrison glanced across the aisle with a puzzled expression, clearly wondering why the service pattern had been interrupted when it reached Jerome's seat. Jerome reached for the call button, pressing it with the calm patience of someone who had spent years learning to navigate these kinds of situations without losing his composure or dignity. The button illuminated with a soft blue light, indicating that his request had been registered by the cabin crew. But several minutes passed before Kyle appeared at his suite looking distinctly uncomfortable as he glanced nervously toward the galley where Savannah was engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation with another crew member. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Kyle asked, his voice quiet and apologetic in a way that suggested he was aware that something inappropriate had occurred, but wasn't sure how to address it directly. "I believe the standard service for first-class passengers includes a pre-flight beverage." Jerome said calmly, his tone carrying no accusation or anger. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the kind of authority that comes from understanding exactly what you're entitled to receive. I'd appreciate some water, please. Still water, no ice. Kyle nodded quickly, clearly relieved that the request was reasonable and straightforward. Of course, sir. I'll get that for you right away. As Kyle hurried toward the galley, Jerome leaned back in his seat and observed the interaction that followed through the partially open galley curtain. The young flight attendant was clearly requesting permission or instructions from Savannah, who responded with sharp gestures and expressions that left no doubt about her feelings regarding Jerome's presence in first class. What exactly is he asking for? Savannah's voice carried clearly through the cabin, sharp and acidic, in a way that contrasted dramatically with the warm tones she had used with other passengers. Just water, Savannah. I was going to get him a bottle from the premium selection. Kyle replied, his voice nervous and deferential. Don't waste our good inventory on someone who probably can't tell the difference between Evian and tap water. Savannah snapped her words, carrying far enough for several passengers to overhear. Give him one of those small plastic bottles from the economy cart. We need to preserve our premium supplies for passengers who actually understand quality and will appreciate what we're offering them. The afternoon sun streaming through the aircraft windows had shifted to the deeper golden tones that preceded sunset, casting long shadows across the first-class cabin as Kyle returned to Jerome's suite, carrying a small, flimsy plastic bottle of lukewarm water that looked like it had been retrieved from a convenience store rather than the premium beverage service that other passengers were enjoying. His face carried the unmistakable expression of someone who understood that he was participating in something wrong but felt powerless to change the situation without risking his own position within the hierarchy of airline service. Here you are, sir, Kyle said quietly as he handed over the bottle. His eyes unable to meet Jerome's directly as shame colored his cheeks with a faint reddish tinge. I apologize for the delay in getting this to you. Jerome accepted the water with a gracious nod, his expression remaining neutral despite the obvious disparity between his treatment and the crystal glassware that had been provided to every other passenger in the cabin. Thank you, Kyle, he replied gently, recognizing that the young man was caught between following orders and doing what he knew to be right. I appreciate your help. The plane began its pushback from the gate with the mechanical precision that marks the beginning of every commercial flight engine's spinning up to create the distinctive whining sound that penetrates even the most luxurious cabin soundproofing. Jerome settled back into his leather seat and retrieved his phone, quickly composing a text message to Arthur Brighton, his chief legal counsel, and the man who had spent countless hours structuring the Pinnacle Airways acquisition. The message was brief but comprehensive. Initiate comprehensive audit of in-flight service protocols with specific attention to consistency across passenger demographics. Document inventory management practices and crew training materials. I want detailed analysis of service standards versus actual implementation before we reach London. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Jerome pulled out a worn leather notebook and began documenting everything he had observed since arriving at JFK Terminal, recording timestamps and direct quotes while the details remained fresh in his memory. He had learned long ago that successful change required detailed documentation of existing problems, and what he was witnessing represented exactly the kind of cultural issues that would need to be addressed if Pinnacle Airways was going to become the airline he envisioned. The safety video played on screens throughout the cabin, featuring beautiful people demonstrating emergency procedures with choreographed precision, while soft instrumental music provided an elegant soundtrack to information about life vests and oxygen masks. Jerome watched the presentation while continuing to observe the crew's interactions with different passengers, noting the subtle but consistent patterns that revealed underlying assumptions about who deserved premium treatment and who should be grateful for basic service. During the meal service that began once they reached cruising altitude, Savannah approached each suite with a leather-bound menu and the kind of detailed consultation that made dining selection feel like a collaboration between passenger and chef. She spent nearly 10 minutes with Morrison discussing the nuances of the Wagyu beef preparation versus the lobster thermidor, while offering wine pairings and explaining the provenance of ingredients with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed sharing knowledge about fine cuisine. When she reached Jerome's suite, the transformation was immediate and unmistakable. She stood beside his seat without kneeling to his eye level as she had done with other passengers, holding a clipboard against her chest like a defensive barrier, while her expression conveyed barely concealed impatience with what she clearly viewed as an unwelcome interruption to her otherwise smooth service routine. "We have chicken or pasta available this evening," she announced curtly, checking her watch as if his decision was delaying more important tasks that required her attention elsewhere in the cabin. Jerome looked up from his notebook, his expression remaining calm despite his growing awareness that he was being deliberately provided with economy-class options while surrounded by passengers who were selecting from gourmet menus that hadn't even been offered to him. "I was under the impression that first-class passengers had access to the full dining menu," he said quietly, his voice carrying no challenge or confrontation, just a simple request for clarification about airline policies. Savannah sighed heavily, creating a sound that carried clearly through the quiet cabin and drew curious glances from nearby passengers who were beginning to notice the unusual dynamic playing out in Suite 1A. "Sir, we have limited quantities of our premium selections, and we prioritize those offerings for our most frequent travelers and full-fare passengers," she said loudly enough for Morrison and others to hear. "By the time we reached your seat, our availability had become somewhat restricted." It was a lie so transparent that even passengers who weren't paying close attention could recognize its falseness, given that the meal service had barely begun, and Jerome was seated in the front row of the cabin, meaning that his suite should have been among the first served rather than the last to receive attention. Morrison looked across the aisle with an expression that mixed embarrassment with disapproval, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing such obvious discriminatory treatment. "I see," Jerome replied, his voice remaining steady, while internally calculating the cost of the cultural transformation that would be required to address these ingrained patterns of behavior. "In that case, I'll have the chicken." Savannah scribbled his selection on her notepad with sharp, aggressive strokes that suggested she viewed his acceptance of the inferior options as confirmation of her assumptions about his background and expectations. As she turned to walk away, Jerome saw Morrison shake his head slightly, his expression conveying the kind of second-hand embarrassment that comes from witnessing someone else's poor behavior in a social setting. The meal that arrived 30 minutes later confirmed everything Jerome had suspected about the deliberate nature of his treatment. While other passengers received their selections on fine china with proper silverware, linen napkins, and elaborate presentations that looked like they had been prepared by restaurant chefs, Jerome's chicken arrived on a standard plastic tray with disposable utensils and a paper napkin that looked like it had been borrowed from the economy cabin. As he ate the rubbery, over-seasoned chicken that bore no resemblance to the aromatic dishes being served around him, Jerome continued his documentation while listening to the conversations that drifted across the cabin. Morrison was discussing his recent acquisition of a tech startup with another passenger, their voices carrying the casual confidence of people accustomed to moving millions of dollars with single decisions, while behind him the venture capitalist was explaining cryptocurrency investments to someone who seemed genuinely interested in learning about blockchain technology. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was one of comfortable exclusivity, where successful people shared stories and insights while enjoying the kind of service that reinforced their sense of belonging to an elite group that deserved special treatment. Jerome found himself thinking about the irony of his situation, sitting among people who would probably be impressed by his business accomplishments if they knew about them, while being treated like an unwelcome intruder whose presence diminished the exclusivity they had paid to experience. After finishing his meal, Jerome excused himself to use the forward lavatory, walking carefully through the cabin as the aircraft encountered some mild turbulence that caused the fuselage to shudder slightly. As he passed Morrison's suite, the tech executive was removing an expensive-looking watch from his wrist, apparently preparing to sleep during the overnight portion of the flight. "My wrist always swells at altitude," Morrison explained to no one in particular, placing what appeared to be a Patek Philippe timepiece on the small side table next to his seat. "This thing costs me more than most people's cars, but I can't wear it comfortably during long flights." Jerome used the facilities and washed his face with cold water, looking at himself in the mirror and seeing the exhaustion that 3 days of negotiations had etched around his eyes. He looked exactly like what Savannah and Brittany had assumed him to be, a tired man in worn clothes who probably didn't belong in first class. But appearances had never been particularly important to him when there was serious work to be done. When he returned to his seat, the cabin lights had been dimmed to encourage rest during the overnight flight, and most passengers had reclined their suites into sleeping positions. Morrison was already snoring softly, his arm dangling off the side of his bed in complete relaxation, while the expensive watch remained visible on his side table, gleaming slightly in the subdued lighting. Jerome settled back into his own suite and pulled out his acquisition documents. Thick stacks of papers marked confidential, Meridian Capital, that detailed every aspect of Pinnacle Airways' operations, from fleet management to employee contracts to customer satisfaction metrics. In the dim light and to untrained eyes, the documents looked like nothing more than random paperwork, but they represented hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions and the future employment of 40,000 people. As he worked through financial projections and operational assessments, Jerome became aware of a disturbance developing somewhere behind him, in the cabin voices raised in concern and the sound of someone moving around frantically in what sounded like a search for something important that had gone missing. The disruption began with a sharp gasp, followed by the frantic rustling of bedding and the metallic sound of someone searching through personal belongings with increasing desperation. Bradley Morrison had awakened from his alcohol-induced sleep to discover that his Patek Philippe Nautilus, the $75,000 timepiece he had so casually displayed before reclining his seat, had vanished from the side table where he distinctly remembered placing it before settling in for the night. "No, no, no." Morrison muttered, his voice rising from confusion to panic as he patted down his blankets, checked the floor around his suite, and began moving the cushions and pillows with the kind of frantic energy that comes from realizing that something irreplaceable has disappeared. "It was right here. I put it right here on the table before I went to sleep." Savannah appeared at his side within seconds, her professional training kicking in as she assessed the situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with passenger emergencies throughout her career. "Mr. Morrison, what seems to be the problem?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of concerned attentiveness that had been completely absent from her interactions with Jerome. "My watch." Morrison stammered, his face flushing red with a combination of embarrassment and growing anger. "My Patek Philippe, the one I showed you earlier. I took it off because of the altitude, set it right there on the side table, and now it's completely gone. Someone must have taken it while I was sleeping." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, immediately transforming the peaceful atmosphere of the darkened cabin into something charged with suspicion and tension. Other passengers began stirring in their suites, awakened by the commotion, and drawn into the drama by the implications of theft at 30,000 feet, where escape was impossible, and everyone became a potential suspect. Savannah's response was immediate and telling in its assumptions. Without conducting any kind of investigation or considering alternative explanations for the missing timepiece, her eyes moved directly to Suite 1A, where Jerome sat quietly reviewing his documents, apparently unaware of the developing crisis. Her expression shifted from concern to something approaching vindication, as if Morrison's loss confirmed suspicions she had been harboring throughout the flight. "Sir?" she said, approaching Jerome's suite with an authority that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, her voice cutting through the cabin silence like a blade designed to draw attention from every passenger within hearing range. "Did you notice anything unusual happening around Mr. Morrison's suite while he was sleeping, Jerome looked up from his papers, immediately understanding the direction this confrontation was heading based on Savannah's tone and body language. "No, I did not notice anything unusual," he replied calmly, his voice steady despite the obvious implications of her question. "I've been working on these documents since shortly after the meal service ended. You were up earlier." Savannah continued, her voice gaining volume and confidence as she constructed her narrative of events. "I saw you walk past Mr. Morrison's suite when you went to use the lavatory approximately 20 minutes ago. You had to pass directly by his seat, and he was sleeping soundly at that time." The cabin had grown completely silent except for the constant hum of jet engines as every passenger and crew member focused their attention on the unfolding drama. Morrison sat up in his bed, his hair disheveled and his expression shifting from confusion to a growing certainty that seemed to be crystallizing around the most convenient explanation for his loss. "He was near my seat," Morrison said, his voice gaining strength as he processed Savannah's implications. "I remember seeing him walk by when I was half asleep, and now my watch is gone." This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when airlines don't properly screen their passengers. Jerome felt the familiar weight of a moment he had experienced countless times throughout his life, that instant when a room full of people decided that his presence was the most logical explanation for something that had gone wrong regardless of evidence or logic. The difference this time was that he owned the airline, employed every person who was casting suspicious glances in his direction, and had the power to address not just this incident, but the cultural assumptions that made it possible. "I did not take your watch," Jerome said clearly, his voice carrying across the cabin with the kind of authority that made several passengers pause and reconsider their assumptions. "I suggest you search your suite more thoroughly before making accusations that you may find difficult to retract." Savannah stepped closer to Jerome's seat, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate and establish dominance through physical presence. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to cooperate with a search of your person and belongings," she announced loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. "We have a very serious situation here involving a valuable item that has gone missing, and we need to resolve it immediately." "You have no authority to conduct any such search," Jerome replied, his voice remaining calm but hardening with the steel that had served him well in countless business negotiations. "I am a paying passenger with rights that are clearly defined in your own company's policies, and I will not submit to harassment based on nothing more than racial profiling and unfounded suspicions." The words racial profiling seemed to electrify the cabin, making explicit what had been implicit in the entire interaction, and several passengers shifted uncomfortably as they recognized the ugly dynamics that were playing out in front of them. But Savannah, rather than backing down, seemed energized by the challenge to her authority and determined to prove that her assumptions were correct. "This aircraft operates under federal aviation regulations that give the crew complete authority to ensure the safety and security of all passengers," she declared, her voice taking on the righteous tone of someone who believes they are enforcing justice rather than perpetuating injustice. "Kyle, please contact the captain immediately and inform him that we have a theft in first class and a passenger who is refusing to cooperate with crew instructions." Kyle hesitated, looking between Savannah and Jerome, with the uncomfortable expression of someone who recognized that the situation was escalating beyond reasonable boundaries. "Savannah, maybe we should search the suite more thoroughly before we involve the captain," he suggested quietly. "Sometimes things fall into unexpected places during turbulence." "Get the captain," Kyle Savannah commanded, her voice brooking no dissent. "Now." As Kyle reluctantly headed toward the cockpit, Jerome reached for his phone and opened the voice recording application, pressing the record button while holding the device clearly visible in his hands. The simple action seemed to infuriate Savannah, who immediately demanded that he stop recording. But Jerome continued to document the interaction with the calm determination of someone who understood that evidence would be crucial in addressing what was happening. "I am recording this interaction to protect myself from false accusations. Jerome stated clearly for the benefit of the recording. I am requesting that crew members state their names and the specific basis for their accusations, so that this incident can be properly investigated by appropriate authorities. The cockpit door opened with a heavy mechanical sound, and Captain Rebecca Sterling emerged into the first-class cabin with the swagger and authority of someone who had spent 25 years commanding aircraft and crews across the Atlantic. She was an imposing woman with platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and the kind of presence that immediately shifted the entire dynamic of any room she entered. Sterling surveyed the situation with quick professional efficiency, taking in Morrison's distressed state, Savannah's aggressive posture, and Jerome's calm documentation of events. Her assessment was swift and definitive, based more on appearance and assumption than on any careful consideration of evidence or alternative explanations. "What exactly is the situation here?" Sterling asked, her voice carrying the deep authority that comes from years of making life-and-death decisions at 40,000 feet. "Captain, we have a passenger in Suite 1A who was observed near Mr. Morrison's seat while Mr. Morrison was sleeping," Savannah reported with the precision of someone delivering crucial intelligence. "Mr. Morrison's $75,000 watch has disappeared, and this passenger is refusing to submit to a security search and is recording our conversation without permission." Sterling's eyes fixed on Jerome with the kind of predatory focus that he recognized from boardrooms where powerful people decided that he represented a problem that needed to be eliminated. She saw his clothes, his race, his calm defiance of crew authority, and made the same snap judgment that had guided every interaction he had experienced since boarding the aircraft. "Sir, I'm going to need you to turn off that recording device and submit to a search immediately," Sterling commanded, stepping closer to Jerome's suite in a clear display of physical intimidation. "We are currently flying over international waters, which means I have complete authority over everything that happens on this aircraft, and I will not tolerate passengers who threaten the security and safety of other travelers." "I am not threatening anyone's security," Jerome replied, his voice steady despite the escalating nature of the confrontation. "I am documenting discriminatory treatment that violates your own company's passenger rights policies, and I will not submit to an illegal search based solely on racial profiling and unsubstantiated accusations." Captain Sterling's face darkened with the kind of anger that comes from being challenged by someone she viewed as fundamentally beneath her authority, her jaw clenching as she processed Jerome's refusal to comply with her demands. The cabin had become completely silent except for the constant drone of engines, with every passenger and crew member frozen in anticipation of how this confrontation would resolve itself at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. "Let me make something absolutely clear to you," Sterling said, her voice dropping to a menacing growl that carried the weight of 25 years of unchallenged command authority. "I don't care what you think about policies or profiling or whatever legal theories you want to quote. We are in international airspace, which means maritime law applies, and I am the absolute authority on this vessel until we touch ground." She leaned closer to Jerome's suite, invading his personal space, with the deliberate intention of using her physical presence to establish dominance and force compliance through intimidation. "You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can have you physically restrained and searched anyway. Either way, that watch is going to be found, and if it's on your person or in your belongings, you're going to spend the rest of this flight in zip-tie restraints." Jerome continued recording while maintaining eye contact with Sterling, his expression calm but his mind racing through the legal and practical implications of what was happening. He understood that any physical resistance would be interpreted as justification for the treatment he was receiving. But he also knew that submission would validate the assumptions that had created this situation in the first place. "Captain Sterling," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made several passengers lean forward to hear more clearly. "I am the owner of significant assets, and I understand exactly what my rights are under both federal and international law. I did not take Mr. Morrison's watch, and I will not submit to an illegal search based on nothing more than the color of my skin and your assumption that I don't belong in first class." Sterling's laugh was harsh and humorless, the sound of someone who had heard similar claims from passengers, who thought they could talk their way out of consequences through bluffing and intimidation. "You own significant assets," she repeated mockingly. "Sure you do. Look, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to make this easy on yourself. Stand up, empty your pockets, and let my crew search your belongings, or I'm going to divert this aircraft to Gander, where you'll be removed in handcuffs and placed on every airline's security watch list." The threat was serious and specific, carrying implications that extended far beyond the current flight. Gander was a remote airport in Newfoundland that served as an emergency diversion point for transatlantic flights, and being forcibly removed there would create a permanent record that could affect Jerome's ability to travel internationally for business purposes that were crucial to his company's operations. Kyle Sterling commanded without taking her eyes off Jerome. "Bring me the restraint kit from the emergency supplies." Kyle looked genuinely distressed as he retrieved a package of heavy-duty zip-tie restraints from a forward storage compartment, his hands shaking slightly as he recognized the severity of what was about to happen. "Captain, are you sure this is necessary?" he asked quietly. "Maybe we should try searching the area around Mr. Morrison's seat more thoroughly before we take such drastic action. He's had his chance to cooperate." Sterling snapped. Now he gets to face the consequences of being uncooperative with Federal Aviation Authority. As Kyle reluctantly handed over the restraints, Jerome calculated the costs of continued resistance versus the strategic value of allowing the situation to escalate to a point where the abuse of authority would become undeniable to everyone present. A diversion to Gander would cost Pinnacle Airways approximately $50,000 in fuel and landing fees, plus passenger compensation and crew overtime, making it an expensive mistake that would be difficult to justify in operational reports. "Very well," Jerome said calmly, powering down his phone but making sure the recording had been properly saved to cloud storage where it would be accessible regardless of what happened to his device. "I will submit to this search under protest, and I want it clearly noted that Captain Rebecca Sterling threatened physical restraint without probable cause or legal justification." Jerome stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening as he held his hands away from his body to demonstrate complete cooperation. Sterling nodded to Savannah, who approached with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that suggested she was enjoying the opportunity to prove her assumptions correct through invasive search procedures. Savannah conducted the search with unnecessary roughness, her hands patting down Jerome's pockets, waistband, and ankles, with the thoroughness of someone who was absolutely certain that contraband would be discovered. She removed his wallet, a worn leather item that contained his driver's license and credit cards, examining each item with suspicion before moving on to check his hoodie pockets and the area around his ankles where someone might conceal stolen property. Nothing on his person. Savannah announced, her voice carrying a note of disappointment that suggested she had been hoping to vindicate her assumptions through the discovery of Morrison's missing timepiece. "Check his bag," Sterling ordered, pointing to Jerome's canvas messenger bag in the overhead compartment. Savannah retrieved the bag and dumped its contents onto Jerome's seat with unnecessary force, spilling clothing toiletries and the stack of Meridian Capital acquisition documents across the leather surface. She shook out each piece of clothing, opened every toiletry container, and rifled through the legal papers without reading them, looking for anything that might be concealing a stolen $75,000 watch. The search revealed nothing more incriminating than day-old socks and the kind of paperwork that anyone might carry during business travel, and Savannah's expression grew increasingly frustrated as she failed to find the evidence that would justify the dramatic accusations and search procedures. "It's not here," she admitted reluctantly, her voice smaller and less confident than it had been when she was making accusations based on assumptions rather than evidence. Sterling's jaw worked as she processed the implications of conducting an illegal search that had produced no results, but rather than acknowledging the mistake or apologizing for the harassment, she doubled down on her original assumptions with the stubborn determination of someone who refused to admit error. He probably disposed of it somehow, she said, grasping for explanations that would preserve her authority and justify her actions. Maybe he passed it to another passenger or hid it somewhere in the cabin. Valuable items don't just disappear on their own. As Savannah began shoving Jerome's belongings back into his bag with careless roughness, a voice called out from several rows behind them, cutting through the tension with the clarity of truth finally emerging from confusion. "Excuse me," said Dr. Patricia Wells, an elderly passenger in Suite 3B who had been quietly observing the entire confrontation with growing discomfort. "I think I found something that might be relevant to this situation." All eyes turned toward Dr. Wells, who was holding up a gleaming object that caught the cabin lighting and immediately drew gasps of recognition from everyone who could see it. In her wrinkled hand was Morrison's Patek Philippe Nautilus, its distinctive face and bracelet unmistakable even from a distance. "I found this on the floor next to the partition between Suites 2B and 3B. Dr. Wells explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades as a university professor and was accustomed to dealing with situations that required careful attention to facts rather than assumptions. "It appears to have slid back here during that turbulence we experienced earlier in the flight, probably when Mr. Morrison's side table was jostled." The silence that followed her announcement was profound and uncomfortable, filled with the weight of false accusations and the recognition that everyone present had participated in or witnessed a profound injustice based on nothing more than prejudice and assumption. Morrison's face went pale as he realized what had actually happened to his watch and what his hasty accusations had set in motion. Sterling stood frozen, her authority suddenly revealed as the foundation for harassment rather than justice, while Savannah looked like someone who had just realized that her career might be ending in real time, as the consequences of her assumptions became clear to everyone present. Dr. Wells walked forward and handed the watch to Morrison, who accepted it with hands that trembled slightly as he processed the magnitude of what his suspicions had caused. "I believe this belongs to you," she said gently, but her eyes moved to Jerome with an expression that conveyed deep regret for what she had witnessed. Morrison looked at the watch, then at Jerome, then at Sterling and Savannah, his face cycling through embarrassment, shame, and the dawning realization that he had participated in something that would be difficult to explain or justify when the story inevitably became public. I'm sorry," Morrison stammered, his voice barely audible as he struggled to find words that could somehow address what had just occurred. "I didn't mean for this to escalate like this. I just woke up and it wasn't there, and I panicked." Jerome straightened his hoodie and retrieved his phone, his expression remaining neutral, despite the vindication that came with having his innocence proven so dramatically. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "next time you lose something, I suggest you look more carefully before you decide that the most likely explanation involves accusing someone of being a criminal based on their appearance." While the first-class cabin settled into an uncomfortable silence punctuated only by Morrison's mumbled apologies and Savannah's attempts to restore some semblance of normal service, Jerome returned to his suite and opened his laptop with the calm efficiency of someone who understood that documentation and communication would be crucial in addressing what had just occurred. The aircraft's Wi-Fi connection allowed him to access his encrypted email system, and he began composing a detailed report that would trigger emergency protocols across Pinnacle Airways' executive hierarchy. The email was addressed to Harrison Blake, the Vice President of Operations, whose phone number was programmed into emergency contact systems that would route urgent messages directly to him regardless of time zones or normal business hours. Jerome's message was comprehensive and precise, detailing every aspect of his experience from the check-in counter encounter with Brittany Lawson through the illegal search conducted by Captain Sterling with timestamps and specific quotes that would allow investigators to verify every claim through security footage and crew communications. Harrison. The email began as of 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. Meridian Capital completed acquisition of controlling interest in Pinnacle Airways. I am currently aboard Flight 847 to London, where I have documented multiple instances of discriminatory treatment that suggest deep cultural problems requiring immediate attention. Please review the attached incident report and prepare comprehensive response protocols for my arrival at Heathrow. 3,000 miles away in Chicago, Harrison Blake's phone began buzzing with the insistent tone that indicated a priority message from the airline's most critical communication systems. Blake had been asleep for less than 2 hours after a grueling day of operational meetings, but the alert system was designed to wake senior executives for genuinely urgent situations that could affect passenger safety or corporate liability. Blake rolled out of bed and grabbed his phone, expecting to see a message about weather delays or mechanical issues that required executive decision-making, but the sender's name made him pause with growing confusion. Jerome Washington was listed in the company's VIP passenger database, but Blake couldn't immediately remember why that name would have priority access to executive emergency communication systems. As he opened the email and began reading the detailed account of discriminatory treatment, Blake's confusion rapidly transformed into horror, and then into the kind of panic that comes from realizing that a catastrophic situation is already in progress and may be too late to contain. The implications of the message became clear as he accessed the corporate acquisition database and confirmed that Meridian Capital had indeed completed purchase of majority ownership in Pinnacle Airways just hours earlier. Jerome Washington wasn't just a passenger filing a complaint about poor service. He was the new owner of the airline documenting discriminatory treatment by employees who had no idea they were harassing their own boss while creating legal liability that could destroy the company they thought they were protecting. Blake immediately activated the Executive Crisis Response Team, placing urgent calls to Patricia Chandler, the European Director of Human Resources, who was based in London, and to the company's Chief Legal Counsel, David Morrison, whose expertise in employment law and civil rights would be crucial in addressing the legal implications of what had occurred. "Patricia, I need you to drop everything and get to Heathrow immediately," Blake said as soon as Chandler answered her phone. "We have a code-red passenger incident involving the new owner, and I need you personally managing the response when Flight 847 lands in approximately 3 hours. Chandler was instantly alert, her years of experience in crisis management kicking in as she recognized the urgency in Blake's voice. "What kind of incident are we talking about, Harrison?" she asked, already reaching for her laptop to access passenger manifests and crew information. "Discriminatory treatment by flight crew. Illegal search, false accusations of theft," Blake replied, his voice tight with controlled panic. "The passenger is Jerome Washington, who completed acquisition of the company this morning. He's documented everything and is probably composing lawsuits while we're talking." The silence on Chandler's end of the call stretched long enough for Blake to worry that the connection had been lost, but finally she responded with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with corporate emergencies. "I'll coordinate with ground services to ensure private arrival procedures and have legal representation standing by," she said. "Do we know the specific crew members involved?" Blake was already pulling up crew manifests and passenger service reports, cross-referencing Jerome's flight information with staffing assignments. Lead flight attendant Savannah Reed, Captain Rebecca Sterling, and ground agent Brittany Lawson at JFK. "I want disciplinary files on all 3 immediately, and I want to know if there's any history of similar complaints." As the crisis team began mobilizing resources across 2 continents, Jerome continued working on his documentation while observing the changed dynamic in the first-class cabin around him. Morrison had retreated to his suite and was staring out the window with the expression of someone processing deep embarrassment, while other passengers maintained careful distance as if proximity to Jerome might somehow implicate them in the discriminatory treatment he had received. Savannah made several attempts to approach Jerome's suite with offers of upgraded meal service and premium beverages. Her manner transformed from hostile dismissal to nervous over-attentiveness that suggested she was beginning to understand that something significant had shifted during the confrontation. Each time Jerome politely declined her offers, maintaining professional courtesy while making it clear that the relationship between crew and passenger had been fundamentally altered by what had occurred. Kyle, the junior flight attendant who had shown flashes of conscience throughout the incident, approached Jerome's suite with genuine concern written across his young face. "Sir, I want you to know that what happened tonight doesn't represent the values that most of us try to bring to our jobs," he said quietly, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who understood the difference between right and wrong, even when authority figures seemed to have lost their moral compass. "I appreciate that," Kyle Jerome replied, recognizing the courage it took for a junior employee to speak against the actions of senior crew members. "Your willingness to question inappropriate orders shows exactly the kind of integrity this airline needs more of." The conversation was brief but meaningful, establishing a connection between Jerome and the one crew member who had consistently demonstrated ethical behavior throughout the crisis. Jerome made a mental note to ensure that Kyle's courage would be recognized and rewarded when the inevitable restructuring of personnel occurred. In London, Patricia Chandler was coordinating an unprecedented response that involved rerouting Jerome's aircraft to a private terminal area typically reserved for diplomatic flights and celebrity arrivals, where media attention could be controlled and executive teams could conduct sensitive conversations without public scrutiny. She had assembled a team of senior managers, employment attorneys, and crisis communication specialists who would be prepared to address every aspect of the situation from legal liability to media management. The financial implications of the crisis were becoming clear as Chandler reviewed similar discrimination cases that had resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements and federal oversight of airline operations. A single incident involving the new owner could trigger Department of Transportation investigations, congressional hearings, and regulatory changes that would affect the entire aviation industry for decades. "We're looking at potential exposure in the hundreds of millions," reported David Morrison, the legal counsel as he reviewed precedent cases and federal civil rights statutes. "If this goes to court, we're not just dealing with individual damages, but with pattern and practice claims that could result in systemic oversight and operational restrictions." Meanwhile, aboard Flight 847, Captain Sterling had retreated to the cockpit where she was consulting with her first officer about the implications of the confrontation and the unusual arrival procedures that had been communicated by air traffic control. The diversion to a private terminal was highly irregular and suggested that corporate executives were treating Jerome Washington as someone whose complaints carried exceptional weight within the company hierarchy. "Do you think he's really someone important?" her first officer asked quietly, reviewing the passenger manifest for any indication of Jerome's actual status or corporate connections. Sterling's jaw was still tight with the stubborn pride that had prevented her from acknowledging error or offering apologies. But privately, she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about Jerome might have been catastrophically wrong. "Important people don't dress like that," she muttered, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried during the confrontation. As the aircraft continued its journey toward London, Jerome completed his incident report and began drafting preliminary recommendations for cultural transformation that would address not just individual employee behavior, but the underlying assumptions and training protocols that had made discriminatory treatment seem acceptable to multiple crew members. The recommendations were comprehensive and would require fundamental changes to hiring practices, training programs, performance evaluation systems, and executive accountability structures. Jerome understood that real change would require more than firing a few employees. It would require rebuilding the entire culture around principles of dignity and respect that applied equally to every passenger, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status. The approaching confrontation at Heathrow would determine whether Pinnacle Airways could transform itself into the kind of company Jerome envisioned, or whether the cultural problems were so deeply embedded that more dramatic restructuring would be necessary to protect both passengers and shareholders from the consequences of institutional discrimination. The descent into London Heathrow was smoother than the turbulence that had marked the earlier portion of the flight, but the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained heavy with the unspoken tension of a confrontation whose consequences had not yet been fully revealed. As the Boeing 787 cut through the gray morning clouds that perpetually shrouded the English countryside, ground control issued unusual instructions that immediately caught Captain Sterling's attention and confirmed her growing suspicion that Jerome Washington was not the ordinary passenger she had assumed him to be. Pinnacle 847. Do not proceed to your assigned gate at Terminal 3. The controller's voice crackled through the cockpit speakers with the kind of authority that suggested these instructions came from the highest levels of airport management. You are directed to taxi to the private aviation area at Stand 42, where ground support and passenger services are standing by for priority handling. Sterling exchanged glances with her first officer, both of them recognizing that private terminal access was typically reserved for diplomatic flights, celebrity arrivals, and corporate executives whose travel required special security or privacy considerations. The fact that their passenger manifest included someone who warranted this level of special handling suggested that the confrontation over Morrison's watch had implications far beyond what anyone in the crew had initially understood. As the aircraft touched down with the characteristic thump and screech of rubber meeting tarmac, Jerome could see through his window that the normal arrival procedures were being bypassed in favor of something that looked more like a state visit than a commercial flight arrival. Instead of the usual gate with its enclosed jet bridge, the aircraft was approaching a remote stand where a formation of vehicles was waiting, with the kind of precision that suggested extensive advance planning. 3 black Mercedes-Benz S-Class sedans were arranged in a diplomatic formation near where the aircraft stairs were being positioned, their engines running and their occupants clearly visible through tinted windows. Standing beside the vehicles were several figures in expensive business suits whose posture and positioning suggested they were senior executives rather than routine ground personnel, along with uniformed airport security officers whose presence indicated that this arrival was being treated as a significant event requiring special protocols. Jerome gathered his belongings while observing the changed behavior of his fellow passengers who were casting curious glances in his direction as they processed the obvious signs that someone in first class was receiving the kind of VIP treatment that suggested connections or importance far beyond what anyone had initially assumed. Morrison was particularly uncomfortable frequently looking toward Jerome's suite, with expressions that cycled between embarrassment and growing concern about the implications of his earlier accusations. Savannah appeared at Jerome's suite one final time, her earlier hostility completely replaced by nervous deference as she attempted damage control through exaggerated courtesy that felt almost as insulting as her previous dismissive treatment. Mr. Washington, I want to personally ensure that your arrival experience meets our highest service standards, she said, her voice artificially bright as she tried to project professionalism despite the obvious anxiety in her manner. Thank you, Savannah, Jerome replied calmly, shouldering his messenger bag and preparing to disembark while mentally preparing for the confrontation that would determine not only her future employment, but the cultural direction of the entire airline. I believe my arrival experience will indeed be quite memorable for everyone involved. The aircraft door opened with the mechanical precision that marked the end of every international flight, but instead of the usual stream of passengers hurrying toward immigration and baggage claim, the disembarkation was carefully controlled to allow Jerome to exit first, while airport security maintained clear pathways through any potential crowd of curious onlookers or media representatives who might have learned about the unusual arrival procedures. As Jerome stepped onto the aircraft stairs, the cool English morning air carried the familiar scent of jet fuel mixed with the industrial odors that characterized major international airports, but the atmosphere around Stand 42 was charged with a tension that had nothing to do with normal aviation operations. Harrison Blake, the vice president of operations, stood at the bottom of the stairs with the kind of deferential posture that immediately communicated respect and concern to anyone observing the interaction. Blake was a man in his early 50s whose silver hair and carefully tailored suit projected the kind of executive authority that came from decades of managing complex airline operations, but his expression carried genuine anxiety as he prepared to address a crisis that could determine the future of the company he had spent his career building. Behind him stood Patricia Chandler, the European Director of Human Resources, whose severe expression and tablet computer suggested that she was prepared to document everything that followed with the precision required for legal proceedings. Mr. Washington Blake said, as Jerome reached the bottom of the stairs, his voice carrying genuine respect mixed with barely controlled panic. I received your message immediately upon landing, and I want you to know that we are treating this incident with the absolute highest priority that our company policies and legal obligations require. Jerome nodded acknowledgement while observing the reactions of crew members who were beginning to disembark behind him, their expressions shifting from confusion to growing alarm as they processed the obvious signs that their passenger complaints and assumptions had triggered executive-level crisis management procedures. Captain Sterling appeared in the aircraft doorway, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible concern as she observed the motorcade and executive reception that suggested Jerome's influence extended far beyond anything she had imagined. "Harrison, I appreciate your prompt response," Jerome replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to being addressed by senior executives with deference rather than the dismissive treatment he had received during the flight. "I trust you've reviewed my preliminary incident report and understand the scope of the cultural issues that need to be addressed immediately." Blake nodded gravely while gesturing toward the lead Mercedes, its rear door already open and waiting. "We have a comprehensive response team assembled at our London offices, including legal counsel and employment specialists, who are prepared to address every aspect of the situation you've documented. If you're willing, we'd like to conduct a full debriefing before determining appropriate disciplinary and corrective measures." As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Jerome could hear Sterling's voice behind them sharp with the kind of authority she had used during the confrontation, but now directed toward Savannah with obvious panic. "What exactly did you tell me about that passenger?" Sterling demanded in a harsh whisper that carried further than she intended. "Did you know who he was when you refused him service?" Savannah's response was barely audible. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she began to understand that her assumptions about Jerome's status and importance had been catastrophically wrong. The realization that she had spent an entire flight treating the airline's new owner with contempt and hostility was transforming her world in real time, and her voice reflected the kind of panic that comes from watching one's career disintegrate with each passing moment. "I need both of you to report to the airport administration offices immediately." Blake called back to the crew members, his voice carrying executive authority that brooked no discussion or delay. "HR representatives will be conducting interviews regarding the incident, and I strongly advise you to contact your union representatives before participating in any formal proceedings." Jerome settled into the leather interior of the Mercedes, while observing the controlled chaos that was beginning to unfold around the aircraft as word of the situation spread through airport personnel and airline staff. The implications of the discrimination incident were rippling outward through the company's communication systems, triggering emergency protocols that would affect operations across multiple continents, as executives scrambled to contain damage that might already be irreversible. Patricia Chandler slid into the seat facing Jerome, her expression professional but concerned as she prepared to begin damage control that would require delicate balancing of legal liability, employee relations, and public relations considerations. "Mr. Washington, before we proceed with formal proceedings, I want to express our profound regret for the treatment you experienced aboard Flight 847, she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who understood that every word would be documented and potentially used in legal proceedings. Patricia Jerome replied, his tone indicating that expressions of regret would not be sufficient to address the scope of the problems he had identified. What I experienced was not an isolated incident involving individual employee misconduct. What I documented represents cultural problems that require structural changes to prevent similar incidents from affecting other passengers who don't have the resources or authority to demand accountability. As the motorcade pulled away from the aircraft toward the private terminal building where comprehensive debriefing sessions would determine the future of multiple careers and possibly the operational structure of the entire airline, Jerome reflected on the irony that his exhausted decision to dress comfortably for a long flight had revealed problems that might have remained hidden for years if he had appeared in executive attire that commanded immediate respect and deference. The private conference room in Heathrow's executive aviation facility had been hastily transformed into a crisis management center, with multiple laptops displaying employee records, policy documents, and incident reports, while senior executives worked to understand the full scope of the discrimination that had occurred during Flight 847. Jerome sat at the head of the polished conference table, no longer wearing his faded Northwestern hoodie, but having changed into a crisp white shirt and charcoal suit that immediately commanded the respect and attention that had been denied him throughout the flight. The transformation was deliberate and symbolic, demonstrating that competence and authority were not determined by appearance while simultaneously showing the airline executives exactly who they were dealing with as the new majority owner of their company. Harrison Blake and Patricia Chandler flanked him at the table, along with David Morrison, the chief legal counsel whose expertise in employment law would be crucial in addressing the liability issues that had been created by the crew's actions. Before we discuss disciplinary measures and corrective actions, Jerome began, his voice carrying the authority of boardrooms and acquisition negotiations. I want everyone in this room to understand that what occurred on Flight 847 was not an isolated incident involving individual employee misconduct. The pattern of discriminatory treatment I documented represents cultural problems that have been allowed to develop over years of inadequate training, insufficient oversight, and management policies that prioritize profit margins over passenger dignity. Blake shifted uncomfortably as he reviewed the comprehensive incident report that detailed not only the specific actions of Sterling Savannah and Brittany Lawson, but also the underlying assumptions and training protocols that had made their discriminatory behavior seem acceptable within the company's operational culture. The legal implications were staggering, with potential exposure that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars if other passengers came forward with similar experiences. Mr. Washington, we are prepared to take immediate action regarding the employees involved in this incident, Chandler said carefully, her voice reflecting the understanding that Jerome's complaints carried the weight of ownership authority rather than ordinary passenger feedback. Captain Sterling and Flight Attendant Reed can be suspended pending investigation with termination proceedings initiated based on the evidence you've provided. Jerome leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful as he considered the scope of changes that would be required to address problems that extended far beyond individual employee behavior. Patricia firing 2 employees might satisfy legal requirements for responding to this specific incident, but it won't address the cultural issues that made their behavior possible in the first place, he said. I'm more interested in understanding how these attitudes developed, and why no supervisory systems caught these problems before they reached the level of illegal searches and false imprisonment threats. The room fell silent as executives processed the implications of Jerome's analysis, recognizing that comprehensive cultural transformation would require resources, time, and fundamental changes to operational procedures that had been in place for decades. David Morrison was reviewing legal precedents and federal regulations, his expression growing increasingly concerned as he calculated the potential scope of liability. If Department of Transportation investigators or civil rights organizations decided to examine Pinnacle Airways' treatment of minority passengers. Sir, if I may address the immediate personnel issues, Morrison said, consulting his tablet for employment records and disciplinary history. Our investigation reveals that both Sterling and Reed have previous complaints in their files related to differential treatment of passengers, but these complaints were resolved through counseling and additional training rather than formal disciplinary action. Jerome's eyes sharpened as he processed this information, understanding that the discriminatory treatment he had experienced was part of a documented pattern that management had chosen to address through minimal interventions rather than meaningful accountability. "Show me those complaint files," he said, his tone indicating that this information would be crucial in determining how extensively the problems had spread throughout the airline's operations. As Morrison accessed the digital records, a troubling picture emerged of repeated incidents where passengers had reported discriminatory treatment by crew members, with complaints consistently resolved through brief counseling sessions and promises of improved training that had obviously failed to change underlying attitudes or behavior. Sterling had 3 previous complaints over 5 years, while Savannah had accumulated 5 incidents involving differential service based on passenger appearance or presumed economic status. This represents a pattern of discriminatory behavior that management knew about but failed to address effectively. Jerome said, his voice hardening as he recognized the scope of institutional failure that had allowed these problems to persist. Every passenger who was mistreated during those previous incidents deserved the same level of concern and accountability that you're showing me now because I happen to own the company. Blake cleared his throat nervously, understanding that Jerome's criticism extended beyond individual employee behavior to include management decisions that had prioritized avoiding confrontation over protecting passenger rights. "Mr. Washington, we are prepared to implement comprehensive changes to our training programs, supervisory procedures, and accountability measures," he said. "We recognize that this incident represents failures at multiple levels of our organization." Harrison. "I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge these problems," Jerome replied. "But I'm interested in solutions that go beyond revised training materials and updated policy documents. I want to see structural changes that make discriminatory treatment impossible, rather than just officially discouraged." Jerome stood and walked to the window overlooking the tarmac where Flight 847 was being cleaned and prepared for its return journey to New York, the same aircraft where he had been subjected to illegal searches and false accusations just hours earlier. "I want to implement real-time monitoring systems that track service consistency across all passenger demographics," he announced. "I want supervisory protocols that require immediate intervention when passengers report differential treatment. And I want accountability measures that make every employee from ground agents to senior flight crews personally responsible for maintaining dignity and respect for all passengers." The executives exchanged glances as they processed the implications of Jerome's demands, recognizing that implementing such comprehensive monitoring and accountability systems would require significant investments in technology training and operational restructuring. But they also understood that the alternative was potential regulatory intervention and legal liability that could threaten the company's survival. "We can begin implementing these changes immediately," Chandler said, her voice reflecting acceptance of the scope of transformation that would be required. "We'll need to coordinate with our training departments, technology teams, and union representatives to ensure smooth transition to new operational procedures." Jerome returned to the table and opened his laptop, displaying a presentation he had prepared during the flight that outlined specific recommendations for cultural transformation, based on best practices from other service industries that had successfully addressed discrimination issues. "I've already drafted preliminary specifications for bias detection software that can analyze service patterns and flag potential discrimination in real time," he said. "I want this system operational within 90 days, with full transparency, reporting that allows passengers to track our progress in eliminating differential treatment." The presentation was comprehensive and professional, demonstrating that Jerome's response to discriminatory treatment was not driven by personal anger, but by strategic analysis of how to prevent similar experiences for future passengers. The proposed changes included employee accountability measures, customer feedback systems, and executive oversight protocols that would make Pinnacle Airways a leader in passenger rights protection. As the meeting progressed, Jerome's vision for the airline became clear, an organization that competed not just on operational efficiency and cost management, but on creating an environment where every passenger was treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived economic status. The transformation would require significant investment and cultural change, but it would also differentiate Pinnacle Airways in an industry that had historically prioritized profit over passenger experience. "There's one more element I want to address," Jerome said as the formal presentation concluded. "I want to recognize employees who demonstrate moral courage in challenging inappropriate behavior, even when that behavior comes from supervisors or senior crew members." He turned to Blake with a slight smile. "During the incident on Flight 847, your junior flight attendant Kyle consistently questioned the appropriateness of the crew's actions and tried to suggest alternative approaches to resolving the situation. That kind of ethical backbone should be rewarded and encouraged throughout the organization." Blake nodded, understanding that creating a culture where employees felt safe challenging inappropriate behavior would be crucial to preventing future incidents. "We can implement recognition programs and protection policies for employees who report discrimination or intervene in inappropriate situations," he said. Jerome closed his laptop and looked around the table at the executives who would be responsible for implementing the cultural transformation he had outlined. "Gentlemen, ladies, what happened to me on Flight 847 was wrong, but it was also an opportunity," he said. "An opportunity to demonstrate that this airline can acknowledge problems, honestly address them comprehensively, and emerge as a leader in passenger rights and dignity. The question is whether you're prepared to do the work necessary to make that transformation real, rather than just another corporate public relations campaign." 6 weeks after the Flight 847 incident, Pinnacle Airways corporate headquarters in Chicago buzzed with the kind of focused energy that accompanies genuine transformation, rather than superficial policy adjustments designed to satisfy legal requirements without changing underlying culture. Jerome had established a temporary office on the executive floor working directly with department heads and operational managers to implement the comprehensive changes he had outlined during the crisis meetings at Heathrow, and the results were already beginning to reshape how the airline approached passenger service and employee accountability. The most visible change was the implementation of the real-time monitoring system that Jerome had developed in partnership with a team of data scientists and civil rights experts, creating algorithms that could analyze service patterns across demographic groups and flag potential discrimination before it escalated to the level of illegal searches or public confrontations. Every passenger interaction was now tracked and measured, with supervisors receiving immediate alerts when service consistency fell below acceptable parameters. Harrison Blake stood in the main operations center watching screens that displayed service metrics from airports across the country, including detailed breakdowns that showed how different passengers were being treated based on appearance, seating class, and demographic characteristics. The transparency was unprecedented in the airline industry, creating accountability at every level of operation while providing passengers with confidence that their treatment was being monitored and evaluated. The system has already identified 12 incidents where crew members were providing differential service based on passenger appearance, Blake reported to Jerome during their weekly progress meeting. In each case, supervisors were able to intervene immediately and correct the behavior before passengers experienced the kind of treatment you documented on Flight 847. Jerome reviewed the incident reports with satisfaction, noting that the early intervention protocols were preventing discrimination rather than just documenting it after passengers had already been harmed. "What about employee response to the new accountability measures?" he asked, understanding that cultural change required buy-in from frontline workers who would ultimately determine whether the new policies translated into genuine behavioral change. Initial resistance from some senior crew members who viewed the monitoring as questioning their professionalism, Blake admitted, but that's been offset by strong support from junior employees who appreciate having clear guidelines and protection when they intervene in inappropriate situations. Kyle Henderson, the flight attendant who questioned the actions on your flight, has become an informal leader in promoting the new culture. The mention of Kyle brought a smile to Jerome's face as the young man's promotion to senior flight attendant and his role as a trainer for the new passenger dignity protocols had proven that moral courage could be rewarded within the airline's operational structure. Kyle had become a symbol of the cultural transformation, demonstrating that employees at every level could contribute to creating an environment where discrimination was not tolerated. Patricia Chandler entered the meeting with updates on the disciplinary proceedings that had concluded the previous week, bringing closure to the specific incidents while establishing precedents for how similar situations would be handled in the future. Captain Sterling and Flight Attendant Reed have been terminated with cause, and their employment records include specific documentation of discriminatory behavior that will prevent them from obtaining similar positions with other airlines, she reported. Jerome nodded approval while reflecting on the broader implications of holding senior employees accountable for behavior that had previously been overlooked or minimized through minimal counseling interventions. "What about Brittany Lawson from the JFK check-in counter?" he asked, remembering the ground agent whose assumptions and hostility had set the tone for everything that followed. "Terminated as well, along with mandatory bias training for her entire department," Chandler replied. "We've also implemented new hiring protocols that include specific evaluation of candidates' ability to interact respectfully with passengers from diverse backgrounds, and we've revised performance evaluation systems to include passenger feedback scores that are weighted equally regardless of the passenger's seating class or demographic profile." The changes extended far beyond individual personnel decisions to encompass fundamental shifts in how the airline operated, from revised training materials that emphasized dignity and respect to executive compensation structures that included bonuses based on passenger satisfaction metrics across all demographic groups. Jerome had insisted that senior management have personal financial incentives to ensure equitable treatment, making discrimination a liability that affected executive earnings rather than just an abstract policy violation. The most significant change has been in passenger complaint resolution, added David Morrison, the legal counsel whose expertise had been crucial in implementing changes that satisfied both legal requirements and operational needs. "We've established an independent passenger advocate office that reports directly to you rather than through operational management, ensuring that discrimination complaints receive proper investigation without conflicts of interest." Jerome was particularly pleased with this development, understanding that passengers needed avenues for addressing problems that didn't depend on the same management structure that had allowed discrimination to persist in the past. The Passenger Advocate Office had already handled dozens of complaints, resolving most through immediate corrective action and service recovery while identifying patterns that required broader policy changes. The financial implications of the transformation had initially concerned shareholders and board members who worried about the costs of comprehensive monitoring systems and enhanced service standards, but the results were exceeding expectations in terms of passenger satisfaction and operational efficiency. Customer complaints had dropped by 68%. Employee satisfaction scores had improved significantly, and the airline was receiving industry recognition for its leadership in passenger rights protection. "We've had inquiries from other airlines about licensing our monitoring systems and training protocols," Blake reported with obvious pride. "The Department of Transportation has requested detailed briefings on our bias detection algorithms, and several universities want to use our implementation as a case study for organizational change management." Jerome felt genuine satisfaction as he reviewed the progress reports. Understanding that the discriminatory treatment he had experienced was being transformed into positive change that would benefit thousands of passengers while demonstrating that airlines could compete on dignity and respect rather than just cost efficiency and operational metrics. The transformation had required significant investment and effort, but it was creating competitive advantages that were already attracting passengers who valued equitable treatment. The most meaningful feedback came from passengers who had experienced the improved service culture, with letters and social media comments praising flight crews who went out of their way to ensure every passenger felt welcomed and respected, regardless of their appearance or background. The stories ranged from elderly passengers who received patient assistance to young travelers who were treated with courtesy despite their casual dress, demonstrating that the cultural changes were creating positive experiences across all demographic groups. There's one more development I want to share. Chandler said, consulting her tablet for recent correspondence. Kyle Henderson has requested permission to develop a peer mentorship program where experienced crew members who demonstrate exemplary passenger relations skills would be paired with new employees to reinforce the dignity and respect protocols during actual flight operations. Jerome approved the proposal immediately, understanding that peer-to-peer reinforcement of positive behavior would be more effective than top-down policy mandates in creating lasting cultural change. Make sure Kyle has the resources and authority he needs to implement this program effectively, he instructed, and ensure that participation in mentorship activities is recognized in performance evaluations and promotion considerations. As the meeting concluded, Jerome reflected on the journey from experiencing discrimination as a passenger to implementing comprehensive changes as an owner, recognizing that his initial anger and frustration had been channeled into systematic improvements that would outlast any individual employee or management team. The changes were being embedded into the airline's operational structure and corporate culture, creating sustainable transformation rather than temporary policy adjustments. Harrison Patricia David Jerome said as the executives prepared to return to their implementation responsibilities, "What we've accomplished over the past 6 weeks demonstrates that discrimination is not an inevitable part of airline operations. It's a choice, and we've chosen dignity and respect for every passenger who trusts us with their travel needs." The transformation of Pinnacle Airways was becoming a model for how organizations could address cultural problems through comprehensive change rather than minimal compliance, proving that business success and ethical behavior were complementary rather than competing priorities. Jerome's experience of discrimination had revealed problems that might have remained hidden for years, but his response had created solutions that were already benefiting thousands of passengers, while establishing new industry standards for equitable treatment. The same JFK Terminal 4 that had witnessed Jerome Washington's discriminatory treatment 6 months earlier now bustled with the familiar energy of international travel. But the atmosphere around Pinnacle Airways check-in counters had been transformed from an environment of assumptions and prejudice into something that genuinely reflected the airline's new commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. Jerome stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office 30 floors above the terminal, watching the afternoon operations, while reflecting on how completely the culture had changed since that exhausting July morning, when his appearance had triggered such hostile reactions. Below him, a nervous teenager named Marcus Chen approached the first-class check-in counter wearing his older brother's borrowed suit jacket that was clearly too large for his slight frame, carrying a contest prize ticket that he had won through a STEM competition but had never imagined he would actually be able to use. 6 months earlier, his appearance and obvious unfamiliarity with luxury travel would have triggered the same assumptions and hostile treatment that Jerome had experienced. But the young man was greeted by Jennifer Martinez, a newly hired agent whose training had emphasized recognizing potential rather than judging appearances. "Good afternoon, and congratulations on your contest win," Jennifer said warmly as she reviewed Marcus's documentation, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm for his achievement rather than skepticism about his right to be in first class. "I see you're traveling to London for the International Science Fair. That's incredibly impressive, and we want to make sure your flight experience matches the significance of this opportunity." Jerome watched the interaction with deep satisfaction, noting how Jennifer took extra time to explain the amenities and services that Marcus would receive during his flight, treating his questions with patience and respect, while ensuring that his first international travel experience would create positive memories rather than the kind of trauma that discrimination could inflict on a young person's confidence and aspirations. The transformation extended far beyond individual employee behavior to encompass comprehensive changes in hiring practices, training protocols, and performance evaluation systems that had eliminated the cultural assumptions that made discriminatory treatment seem acceptable. Every new employee completed extensive bias awareness training, participated in simulation exercises that required them to serve passengers from diverse backgrounds, and received ongoing coaching from mentors like Kyle Henderson, whose moral courage during the Flight 847 incident had made him a symbol of the airline's new values. Harrison Blake entered Jerome's office, carrying the quarterly performance report that documented the measurable results of the cultural transformation, including customer satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, and operational efficiency metrics that demonstrated the business benefits of treating all passengers with dignity and respect. The numbers continue to exceed our projections across every category we measure, Blake reported with obvious pride in what the organization had accomplished. Customer complaints had dropped by 78% compared to the same period in the previous year, with particular improvements in satisfaction scores from passengers who had previously reported feeling unwelcome or discriminated against based on their appearance or background. Employee satisfaction had increased even more dramatically as workers reported feeling proud of their jobs and confident that they could provide excellent service without having to make judgments about which passengers deserved premium treatment. The bias detection algorithms have identified and prevented over 300 potential discrimination incidents. Blake continued referring to the real-time monitoring system that had become an industry standard for ensuring equitable passenger treatment. In each case, supervisory intervention was able to correct problematic behavior before passengers experienced any negative impact, and the employees involved received additional coaching to prevent similar issues in the future. Jerome nodded with satisfaction while continuing to observe the terminal operations below, where passengers from all backgrounds were receiving consistent, respectful service that reflected their shared humanity rather than assumptions about their economic status or social position. "What about industry response to our changes?" he asked. Understanding that Pinnacle Airways' transformation had created pressure on other airlines to examine their own cultures and practices. "We've had formal requests from 12 other airlines to license our training materials and monitoring systems," Blake replied. "The Department of Transportation has proposed making bias detection technology a regulatory requirement for all major carriers, and several business schools are developing case studies about our implementation process." The ripple effects of Jerome's experience and response had extended far beyond Pinnacle Airways to influence industry-wide discussions about passenger rights, cultural competency, and the business benefits of creating inclusive environments that welcomed travelers regardless of their appearance or background. Airlines that had initially resisted similar changes were now implementing their own bias training programs and monitoring systems as they recognized that discrimination created legal liability and competitive disadvantages. Jerome turned from the window to face Blake, his expression reflecting both satisfaction with the progress that had been achieved and determination to continue pushing for improvements that would benefit every passenger who chose to travel with Pinnacle Airways. "Harrison, what we've accomplished proves that discrimination is not an inevitable part of airline operations," he said. "It's a choice, and we've chosen to compete on dignity, respect, and genuine hospitality rather than just operational efficiency and cost management." The transformation had required significant investment in technology training and cultural change management, but the results had exceeded every projection for customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and operational performance. Pinnacle Airways had become known not just for reliable service and competitive pricing, but for creating an environment where every passenger felt valued and respected regardless of their appearance, background, or previous travel experience. As Blake left to oversee the afternoon operations, Jerome remained at the window watching young Marcus Chen disappear into the security checkpoint with a confident smile that suggested his positive experience at check-in had set the tone for an international adventure that would expand his horizons and reinforce his belief that achievement and opportunity were available to anyone willing to work for them. The executive suite on the 42nd floor of Pinnacle Airways' Chicago headquarters had been redesigned to reflect Jerome Washington's vision of leadership that prioritized transparency and connection over traditional corporate hierarchy, with glass walls that allowed him to observe operations throughout the building while remaining accessible to employees at every level of the organization. On the wall behind his desk hung a simple frame containing his faded Northwestern University hoodie, the same garment that had triggered such hostile assumptions during his flight 6 months earlier, now serving as a daily reminder that dignity and respect should never be determined by appearance or superficial judgments. Patricia Chandler entered with the final quarterly report of the year, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had helped orchestrate one of the most successful organizational transformations in airline industry history. "The numbers are exceptional across every metric we track," she announced, placing the comprehensive analysis on Jerome's desk. "Customer satisfaction is up. 89% employee retention has reached a 10-year high, and we're receiving applications from top talent throughout the industry who want to work for an organization that prioritizes ethical behavior alongside operational excellence." Jerome reviewed the report while reflecting on how completely the airline had transformed from an organization that tolerated discrimination into an industry leader in passenger rights and cultural competency. The changes had extended beyond policy revisions to encompass fundamental shifts in hiring, training, performance evaluation, and executive accountability that made equitable treatment a core competitive advantage rather than just a legal requirement. The financial results had exceeded every projection, with passenger loyalty increasing dramatically as travelers chose Pinnacle Airways specifically because of its reputation for treating everyone with dignity and respect. Corporate clients were selecting the airline for business travel based on its commitment to inclusive service, and the company had received numerous industry awards recognizing its leadership in organizational change and passenger advocacy. "There's one final item I want to share," Chandler said, consulting her tablet for recent correspondence. "We received a handwritten letter from Savannah Reed, the former flight attendant who was terminated after the Flight 847 incident." Jerome looked up with interest, curious about what his former antagonist might have to say after 6 months of presumably reflecting on the consequences of her discriminatory behavior. Chandler handed him the letter, which was written in careful script on personal stationery that suggested considerable thought had gone into its composition. "Mr. Washington," the letter began, "I have spent the past 6 months confronting the ugliness of my assumptions and behavior during your flight to London. I lost my career because of choices I made based on prejudice and arrogance. But more importantly, I contributed to a culture that denied dignity to passengers who deserved better treatment. I am writing not to seek forgiveness or employment, but to acknowledge that your response to discrimination has created positive change that extends far beyond Pinnacle Airways to influence how I see other people and how I treat everyone I encounter in my daily life." Jerome set the letter aside and walked to the window overlooking the operations center where hundreds of employees worked to ensure that every passenger received the kind of service that reflected their shared humanity rather than assumptions about their status or background. The view reminded him that transformation was an ongoing process, rather than a destination requiring constant attention and commitment from leaders who understood that ethical behavior was not just morally correct, but essential for sustainable business success. "Send Ms. Reed a gift basket," Jerome told Chandler, along with information about bias training programs and second-chance employment opportunities in the hospitality industry. People can change when they're given the opportunity and support to examine their assumptions and develop better ways of treating others. The gesture reflected Jerome's understanding that lasting change required compassion alongside accountability, creating opportunities for growth and redemption while maintaining clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Pinnacle Airways had become more than just an airline. It had become a model for how organizations could create cultures that brought out the best in both employees and customers, while demonstrating that dignity and respect were not just moral imperatives, but sound business strategies that created competitive advantages in an increasingly diverse marketplace. As the day concluded, and the operations center prepared for overnight flights that would carry passengers around the world, Jerome reflected on the journey from experiencing humiliation in Seat 1A to creating systematic changes that would protect future travelers from similar treatment. The transformation proved that individual experiences of injustice could become catalysts for broader change when responded to with strategic thinking, sustained commitment, and the moral courage to demand better from institutions that had the power to treat people with dignity or deny it, based on superficial assumptions about who deserved respect and who could be dismissed without consequence. This story reminds us that true power doesn't announce itself with expensive clothes or flashy accessories, but reveals itself through character integrity and the wisdom to transform moments of injustice into opportunities for positive change that benefit everyone. When we judge others by their appearance rather than their humanity, we risk missing the most important lesson of all: that dignity and respect should be universal rights rather than privileges reserved for those who look like they can afford them. Jerome Washington's experience shows us that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one who gets overlooked, and that real leadership means using power and privilege to lift others up rather than put them down. By choosing transformation over revenge, he proved that lasting change comes not from destroying those who wrong us, but from creating systems that prevent others from experiencing similar injustice. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of justice, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background, because change begins when we decide that discrimination has no place in our world.